So what does that mean? What can I do as a state legislator, seeing this and believing this and thinking it's true? What is my responsibility? Well, my responsibility is, during this period that we have until there's an implosion or a meltdown or whatever you want to call it in Washington, D.C., is to get South Carolina's house in order, to weatherproof us, to make us strong, to make us a state that is able to address the needs of our constituents when that inevitable time comes and the federal government stops sending money down to us to the degree it has in the past. Let me just use one example of what I think will happen. Medicaid. Not Medicare, but Medicaid, which is health insurance for the poor in South Carolina. It's run by the state government. And the way that it's funded is that for every dollar that the state appropriates for Medicaid in the budget each year, the federal government matches it with $3 in return. So it's a 3-to-1 match. And so what did we in South Carolina do when the recession hit and we went from a high of $7 billion in the general fund in 2007 down to a low of $5 billion in 2009? It's a $2 billion, I mean, 7 to 5, that's a huge drop on a percentage basis. What did we do? Well, we took money out of education and out of roads and out of law enforcement and out of core government services. Man, I'm not an anarchist. I don't believe there's no role for government. There's a role, not much, but and we took the money from those things and we diverted it into Medicaid because we wanted to have that 3-to-1 federal match. And the argument was on the floor that let's take money from schools and from roads and from law enforcement and from SLED and from corrections and from whatever, and let's dump it into Medicaid and expand that Medicaid pool, and by a magic federal alchemy, we'll get $3 in return from Washington, D.C., and we'll be in great shape. Well, do you remember when Mark Sanford refused to take that stimulus money?
Yes.
He refused to take that $787 million. The reason he did was, and this is back in 2009, not the Affordable Care Act, before that, the very first thing he did, the stimulus, is that the federal government says we have $787 million for you, South Carolina, that you can put into your Medicaid program. And if you don't use it, we're going to give it to some other states. And so the legislators are just salivating. They want this money. And so, they want to appropriate it, but the hitch was, it seemed as if the governor had to make an application for those funds. The way that that stimulus package was set up, it was a large chunk of it was at the governor's discretion. And Governor Sanford said, no, I'm not going to take that money. And so you ask yourself, well, why is that? Well, because the strings that were attached to that $707 million was that if you take that money, you can no longer shrink your Medicaid pool. You have to have a Medicaid pool that is at the size that we dictated, and you can never contract it. And that's important because there are 3 cost drivers when it comes to Medicaid, 3 things that drive costs. One is the size of the population, the number of people that are getting the services. The second is the scope of services, the things that being in the program entitles them to get from doctors and hospitals. And the third cost driver is what amount of money is paid to the actual providers of medical services, hospitals and doctors, and what do you pay them? Well, we were about to surrender control over that, one of those primary cost drivers, because typically you define a Medicaid pool as a percentage of the federal poverty index. And, it was about 150% at one point in time. And I think federal poverty index was like 12 or 13,000, whatever it is. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what it is. But as that pool got larger and we couldn't afford it, we would always contract that pool back down. Well, now we have, thanks to taking this money and thanks to surrendering control over that to the federal government, the pool is 200% of federal poverty. We have 1 million people in Medicaid right now. Out of 4.6 million South Carolinians, a little over 1 million people are in Medicaid right now. And Tony Keck at HHS is powerless to contract that down to 175% of poverty or 150% of poverty to control costs because we've given that away. And so you look at what's going to happen over time. The federal government, when that meltdown hits that I've talked about, before it touches Medicare and before it touches Social Security and before it touches any other entitlement, it's going to go after Medicaid and it's going to say to states, we can no longer give you a 3-to-1 match ratio. We'll give you now 2-to-1 or 1.5-to-1. That's all we can afford. Well, what are we going to do with South Carolina now? We've got 1.1 million people in the pool. It's projected to be 1.4 million people by the year 2014. So we're going to have all these people in the pool, and we're not going to have as much federal money coming down because we took those pieces of silver back in 2009. So, what are the other two cost drivers? Can we do something with those? Well, the second cost driver is what? The services that are rendered. Well, we're told by the federal government what we have to do, what we have to provide. And if we don't provide those services, then we don't get any Medicaid match. So you really can't do anything there. And then the third cost driver is provider reimbursement. Well, you can't simply keep squeezing doctors, because if you keep lowering the amount of money they get, they're going to opt out of Medicaid entirely and not provide any care. And that means individuals are going to go to emergency rooms for care. And that means costs are going to exponentially rise. So we've got no controls over this predicament that we voluntarily got ourselves in. We have an exploding Medicaid pool. We're going to have less federal dollars coming down here.